Welcome to WorldBuilding Films, where we analyze the world, settings, and rules of films and TV shows to see if they work, if they don't, and if not, how they could be improved to enhance their stories. Today, we're talking about one of the most underrated of Disney animated films, Atlantis: The Lost Empire. And it was definitely a change of formula because it wasn't a musical, it had a completely different style, and it was much more action-adventure oriented and for quote-unquote older kids. And the risks showed, not earning a lot at the box office at the time, but slowly gathering a cult following over the years. But amongst its highs and lows, what we're going to focus on here today is the world building of Atlantis itself. And well, not gonna lie, this is actually one of the best examples of world building that Disney has ever produced. But let's not waste any more time and get right to it. As usual, there will be spoilers ahead. The plot. Our story actually opens with a prologue of Atlantis itself 10,000 years ago, where a huge explosion caused a tsunami to head for the famous advanced city. Just before it hit, the queen is chosen to merge with the main power source of the city, which we'll get to later, and creates a barrier to protect the center of the city, sinking it into the depths of the ocean. We then cut to 1914 and meet our protagonist, Milo Thatch, a linguist and cartographer who seems to have discovered the location of Atlantis, a notion that garners him the reputation of a hack. That is, until a millionaire named Preston Whitmore contacts him, saying he wanted to fund that expedition to Atlantis in memory of his friend, Milo's grandfather, after having found an ancient book called the Shepherd's Journal, and it has the missing information needed that only Milo can translate. So a massive operation goes underway with a team of fun, memorable characters going in a submarine along with Milo to officially find the underwater city. Gee, I wonder what this whole intro reminds me of. After they dive, they're attacked by a giant mechanical creature called the Leviathan, escape just in time, and after a long series of underground travels, they actually manage to reach Atlantis, seeing it does exist, and we begin to explore their culture while meeting their king and his daughter Kida. Apparently the Atlanteans have been living in this underground bubble where their main power source, called the Heart of Atlantis, is what allows them to survive there, giving them longevity, allowing them to heal, power their vehicles, etc. For some reason, however, they also have forgotten how to read and write their own language, and that's where Milo's help comes in. The king even explains what happened in their history. Basically, Atlantis thrived in the old world, becoming a technological powerhouse, and the king wanted to use said power as a weapon to conquer other civilizations. But an attack of theirs is accidentally triggered prematurely, causing the very tsunami that sunk the city. Back then, the heart, which it turns out absorbs the collective emotions of all Atlanteans and has become self-conscious, decided to absorb the queen, Kida's mother, in order to have enough power to save the city, and the king considers their new underwater environment sort of as a punishment from the heart for having been too arrogant, and he won't let Atlantis return to its glory lest history repeats itself, and Kida becomes the next one to be sacrificed. It all goes south, however, when the team members turn out to be mercenaries and surprise villains, the first in a long series of tropes for Disney, led by General Rourke, and threaten the king until they hand over all their goods. And the greatest one is indeed the heart, which was underneath the king's chamber, which, by the way, could have been hidden way better, but I digress. When they reach it, the heart actually does choose Kida for some reason, almost hypnotizing her, and, in a frankly stunning sequence, she and the heart merge into one, turning into, well, for convenience sakes, I'm just gonna call her Ultra Kida. Ultra Kida, however, lets the mercenaries imprison her for some reason, and they all depart, leaving Milo behind with the Atlanteans, who see their crystals fade without their source. But the rest of Milo's team grows a conscience and stay behind, and together they decide to power up the city's dormant vehicles and attack Rourke before they can make their getaway. They save Ultra Kida and bring her back to Atlantis, but their rescue caused a dormant volcano to erupt. It's only then that Ultra Kida seems to give a damn, and she activates her powers in full, awakes these giant stone guardians, and creates a massive force field to protect and save the city, after which Kida returns to normal. The day is saved, the others decide to return home and become rich with the gold that the Atlanteans offer, so I guess not that much has changed, and Milo decides that it's best if he stays in Atlantis with Kida so that he can help them rediscover their past and perhaps one day advance again with their newfound wisdom. Okay, considering that it has a short runtime, the film actually packs a lot of info, and there's a lot to discuss here regarding Atlantis' history, its people, and their overall world building. And, ironically enough, while I will have some critiques, there's very few this time because the rest is shockingly well constructed. In fact, I like to start by talking about just that. How well the writers worked on the world building of the city. So, let's dive into praises. And trust me, there's a lot to praise here, so let's start from the very beginning of their history. The film itself doesn't explain it, but behind the scenes info gives some interesting insights. Around 100,000 years ago, there was a comet that was surfing through space, when a small piece detached from it and landed on Earth. This space debris was found by the Atlanteans when they were still primordial and has helped them improve their overall intelligence until they rapidly became an advanced civilization. At the same time, this space debris, later known as the Heart of Atlantis, absorbed their memories and emotions until it became self-conscious and self-aware. In fact, it seems like it has absorbed many of the old kings of the past themselves, who have become floating stones with their faces orbiting around it all the time. Considering that it has to follow the fate of the original myth told by the philosopher Plato, that of a fictional city that sank into the ocean because it became too powerful and arrogant, the film follows that very example. Not only did it sink, but it sank because of their own arrogance in using its great power for war instead of development. It's pretty consistent both as an adaptation and as a new spin on the legend. Plus, there's a whole bunch of other fun details. For example, the alphabet. The Atlantean language was actually created in full for this film by the same guy who created Klingon for Star Trek. And not only that, but, fun fact, the A in the Atlantean alphabet is designed to represent the tunnels that lead to the city, the borders surrounding it, all leading to the very heart of Atlantis. It's a literal treasure map. That's, oh, so good! Then you have their age and biology. You'd think that after living for like 10,000 years underwater with no sunlight would make them pale as f***, but no, their age actually slows so much that it's basically still the same generations, all kept intact exactly as they once were, with no particular changes thanks to the Heart of Atlantis, so it all checks out. Heck, on that note, I was even wondering how they'd survive down there for so long, considering that there are all these massive, dangerous creatures lurking in this underworld, but yet again, the heart provides, because the Atlanteans can use the crystals to heal instantly from any attack. Sure, maybe they would have benefited from also being a bit stronger thanks to the crystals, but considering that they've returned to being basically primordial since their downfall, after millennia they've probably become incredible experts in hunting and gathering giant creatures, much like how we hunted mammoths to extinction in the past. The only thing they weren't prepared for were guns, which are definitely beyond their pay grade. And when it comes to further protection, the Heart ensured that the unstoppable Leviathan would be there to guard the main axis all the time, to the point that maybe the Atlanteans themselves can't get past it, and even if they did, they'd have to face several metric tons of water pressure crushing their bodies. As far as their architecture and design goes, the creators of the film specifically said they didn't want it to mirror any single one like Greece or whatever. Instead, they took pieces of all cultures, because the logic here is that all other cultures were instead the ones to originally take inspiration from Atlantis, thus making this a unique style that is a mix of everything. Not to mention that since everything derives from the Heart of Atlantis, it's super cool that their designs all reflect the various shapes and patterns that these energy waves make. Then we have their ecosystem. The Heart created this bubble for them to survive in when it sank, and I guess created every other tunnel there too, I don't know. And it kinda helps provide everything they could need. For example, they have water which I imagine comes from the ocean around them all the way under the city, which spills outward and keeps the dormant volcano around them cool, the steam of which can even cause clouds so they have a microclimate. Along with that water, there could be plenty of sea creatures that find their way through those underground tunnels that the Atlanteans can fish out at the surface and eat limitlessly when they re-emerge. Also, and this is apparently canon, the creatures there weren't just new species on Earth waiting to be discovered, but creatures modified and influenced by the heart. So even something like these fireflies, which literally burn things, can serve a purpose. If they're controlled by the same source, they can both provide lighting and fire and heat, while being commanded not to attack the Atlanteans. And even if they did, they'll just heal anyway. On that note, there doesn't seem to be a single regular light source, but considering that Moliere points out that the fireflies are bioluminescent, it can be assumed that there's some plants or algae or whatever creating this soft blue light around the city, along of course with regular oxygen. And if it isn't enough light, hey, the heart provides and makes sure that it's enough for their physiology to survive on. I know, it does feel like cheating and maybe I'm filling out a few holes with this thing, but hey, the whole plot does revolve around it, so I can't exactly fault the film. The writers really did do their homework on this. But with that said, they didn't exactly do everything right. So, now that I've praised it enough, let's start talking about some issues, such as forgetting language. When Milo and his team first reach Atlantis, they find out, among other things, that the Atlantean dialect is like the root of all languages, so technically they can speak any language. But at the same time, they forgot how to read Atlantean runes, to the point that Milo is the one person who can help them rediscover their origins and how to use their advanced tech. So yeah, as you can imagine, both of these don't make sense. First off, Atlantean being the root of all languages doesn't mean they have access to all modern languages that came after. And frankly, while it's already a pretty big MacGuffin, the solution could have been pretty simple. Just use the heart of Atlantis again. For real, since it gathers the collective emotions of its people, while there would be a great language barrier at first, the longer they stay with Milo and his team, the more the heart would learn their language as well by being in proximity to them, and inform the Atlanteans through their crystals on how to speak English. It would function as a universal translator. I mean, might as well go all the way at this point, right? Then there's the issue of forgetting how to read their own alphabet. This is sort of explained when the king talks to Kida, where through some kind of forced exposition, we found out Atlanteans have actually been receding in their advancements, and the king is purposefully allowing this because he sees it as a form of punishment for his own arrogance in the past, along with being trapped underwater. So maybe the heart is actually making them forget how to read and write? Because it's the only real explanation I can think of, considering that these are the exact same people who lived 10,000 years ago through extended longevity, and so it couldn't have been lost through generations. In fact, I was considering the idea that perhaps, despite having prolonged lifespans, Atlantean minds weren't guaranteed being able to contain such prolonged informations, and so every few hundred years their memories would almost reset, kind of like emptying out a full hard drive. But then again, both Kida and the king do remember the day of the flood, so unless it happens to everyone except royal blood, that theory makes no sense. And if I were to say again that it was the heart that artificially made them forget, then indeed we might as well make it the title of the film. So what other explanations can there be? Well, perhaps it has nothing to do with magic MacGuffins or anything, but with their psychology. Atlantis, both in the original myth and the film, revolves around the idea of the consequences of becoming greedy and arrogant. Since they've literally been punished in a drastic way for their actions, especially the kings, ever since they've been buried below, their guilt would have informed everything of their new lifestyles. Anything having to do with their past thriving era would be a constant reminder of their self-inflicted guilt they'd be suffering from. And this negative association would make them want to abandon it all, including their language, considering it's something they should never pursue again, especially if the king himself imposed it. And after millennia, no matter how much the heart can intervene, a willing lack of practice would guarantee they'd have completely forgotten how to read the Atlantean scriptures. In fact, since language and writing are the main signs of civilization, if they associate them with development, and by proxy with their guilt, it would reinforce all the more why these people's culture would have degraded more and more until they reached a primordial level once again. The only exception for this would be Kida, whom, by seeing her father, would know how much harm excessive guilt can cause, and would be the only one hell-bent on trying to preserve the knowledge of Atlantean runes, which she'd fail at because the lack of practice would still affect her as well after such a long time. Hence why she'd be so excited to talk to someone like Milo the moment she knows he can read. Vehicles. The most iconic visual of the whole film is the fact that Atlanteans use these large fish-shaped vehicles that, when activated with their individual crystals, can easily fly through the air. Aside from the fact that they're super cool, I always assumed that they chose these fish designs because, it's freaking Atlantis. The main thing you associate with it is the fact that it sank into the ocean, so fish themes make sense, right? However, that's if we assume that they were created after the city sank. Instead, they were present when the city was still on land. So why go with the fish design at all? Well, there might be an explanation we could give, and the clue is in the death of Rourke. He dies at the end of the film because Milo cut him with a shard of glass stained with the energy from Ultra Kida, and it turns him into this weird blue statue thing. But see, he doesn't actually die in that moment. It's only after when the propellers of this balloon slash into him, breaking him into pieces, meaning it's not the crystallizing itself that becomes fatal necessarily. He could still move. So, why don't we apply this to the vehicles? What if, instead of just being these mechanical machines that happen to be fish-shaped, they actually were fish in the past, nearly prehistoric ones mind you, and through the power of the heart, Atlanteans turned them into these enormous crystal-like creatures? Cause see, when Rourke is transformed, he went from a regular human to having this strange beast-like mentality. So by proxy, if it happened to regular animals, they could be mentally degraded even more until they became not just docile, but fully under the control of whoever transformed them. And the metal parts could have been just that, an armor, or even just full sci-fi upgrades, that Atlanteans put after to make sure they'd be super resistant and didn't shatter at the first impact like Rourke did. It wouldn't even be too strange to assume they choose fish of all things, because land creatures in the past could have been big, sure, but the bigger they were, the less aerodynamic they became, whereas birds just don't become that big. Fish instead have to be aerodynamic so water flows smoothly around them. Plus they don't have to worry about the square cube law because they're underwater and can be bigger more easily, making them the perfect candidate to become excellent vehicles for Atlanteans to use. Just, don't make the way they turn on this simple, cause there's no way they would have lived for millennia underwater and not figure this out eventually. Generational differences. Now, as much as we did say that the Atlanteans have their lives artificially extended for millennia, there is one perplexing detail that wasn't really explored, and that is the children of Atlantis. We see plenty of them roaming around and playing there, and the setting feels very much like a regular small and humble native scenery. However, there's a problem. You have a civilization whose lifespan is several thousands of years old, with many who would remember Atlantis before the flood, but also a generation of children born later who never saw the surface world despite being aware of it. So while we can say that with this prolonged lifespan, Atlanteans might reproduce so slowly that maybe they get like one birth every few hundred years or something to avoid overpopulation, in which case births would be a big event, there's still the issue that there would be huge generational differences here. If we stick to what's explained in the film, shouldn't these kids be frustrated at the idea that there was an entire world outside of their home that they have absolutely no way of seeing? It's not like the surface world is a secret, since Atlanteans immediately recognized Milo and his team as outsiders, and if this was the case, kids and teenagers who were born after the flood would be considered much more rebellious types. Since they all last for a super long time and their crystals heal them anyway, it's not like these kids would need adults for that long. Give them between 30 to 50 years, and even if they're physically kids, they should have the proper knowledge and discipline on how to be independent. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was an entire other section of Atlantis dedicated only to them, where they'd look for ways to reach the surface in vain, since the Leviathan still guards the access to the city and the crushing water pressure would do them in, or where they try to form their own mini-society built on hatred for their elders, feeling that it's unjust for them to be punished for having done nothing wrong. However, if instead we keep our previous scenario of their written language forgotten over time out of sheer guilt, perhaps that could influence the development of these children where, since they wouldn't have witnessed the time in which the heart was actually a force of prosperity, and there would be too much fear and guilt at the mere idea of education, they'd see the heart even more as a god and as a menacing one, where they'd be paranoid about everything they do in their lives out of fear that it would be enough to earn further punishment. Either way you look at it, frankly, the existence of these kids post-flood would most likely have informed their development very, very differently. And now folks, we enter the final topic of this video, and that is the heart of Atlantis. So while all the things that happen in the film are caused by the heart of Atlantis, it's important to also analyze more in detail how this thing works. We know that it's apparently a piece of comet that fell on Earth eons ago. That alone can just explain most of the sci-fi-ish stuff that it can do, so that's fine. And since it seems to thrive on the collective emotions of Atlanteans, it sort of gained its own consciousness based on them, and apparently took action to protect the city when its own power was misused. Not to mention that it looks awesome with the floating stones of the past kings. With that said, there are 3 small details that don't seem to add up, and they happen after Kida is chosen to merge with the heart. The first one is that, when it happens, she floats back down and the stones actually fall. It's as if their energy was suddenly gone, and yet when Kida's mother merged in the past, they just spun and worked their magic without any issues, just like Kida herself does later. The second issue is, why did Ultra Kida just give herself up to Rourke? We see what the power can do, so how come she didn't put up any fight at all when later she proved that she clearly could have? And third, when Rourke does lock her up and take her away, all the crystals of the other Atlanteans start to fade because the source of their power was leaving. Yet when Milo convinced them to use the crystals to power up the flying fish vehicles again, they were easily enough to power them. But weren't they weaker just a moment ago? What gives? Is there anything else we can tie to explain all of this? Actually, believe it or not, we could work with them after all, and it's all thanks to one line the heart gives to Milo through Kida just before they merged. Be not afraid. Given the context of everything that happens after, this one line might have been the biggest clue, implying that the heart actually knew what was about to happen all along. It was all planned. So what, it can sense through time now too? No, it doesn't feel right, and there must be one more missing element. And in fact, there is. If you recall, when the heart chooses someone to merge with, it's said it can only be someone of royal blood. But the only 2 people we do see merge are Kida's mother, who by the way is explained as not returning back because she stayed in the heart for too long and was lost to it, and Kida herself. And then we have the stones, which are all the Atlantean kings of the past. Notice a difference here? Not a single queen is seen floating around it, and it's never implied that a king could be absorbed into it. And yes, while it's just not specified, why don't we make this literal? Whenever an Atlantean of royal blood has to quote-unquote ascend, the heart chooses the, souls or whatever of males to protect it, and only females to merge with it. Why? I propose that the reason is that since the relationship between the heart and the Atlanteans is 2 ways, it helps them develop and expand, and in return it grows a conscience of its own through them. And being such a powerful and perfect entity, through this exchange the heart could copy and embody simultaneously the spirit of the archetypical male and female humans. Males for protection and females for their gift to create and provide. The heart becomes a sort of parent for the entire civilization, and as such it only wants the best for its quote-unquote children. It shows this in particular when it saw the first signs of misuse the moment the king tried to turn the heart's power into a weapon. Maybe that explosion misfired by accident as implied by the soldiers in the opening, or maybe the heart itself misfired on purpose because, as a divine parent, it felt the need to punish the actions of its children, to show how bad things can get. The explosion was actually an excuse to generate a tidal wave and sink Atlantis so they wouldn't harm other civilizations again, literally putting them in timeout until they learned their lesson. And learn it they did, as the Atlanteans lived for thousands of years in complete and utter repent, while still having their lives extended so they'd keep repenting without the sweet release of death. But now there's a problem, for they've been trapped there for so long that they began to degenerate, returning to a primordial lifestyle and mentality, and if that trajectory continued, eventually they'd just become animals again. The heart might have felt that the punishment had gone long enough, but it was concerned that if Atlantis had resurfaced and re-attempted war and not actually learned their lesson, the rest of the world could be at stake again. That is, until Milo and his team reached Atlantis first, all on their own, just as they were on the brink of scientific progress and discovery during the first Industrial Revolution, thanks to nothing but their wits and sense of exploration. And sure, the heart could have felt beforehand that Rourke actually had bad intentions and that history could have repeated itself, but then again, through Kita's crystal, it could have sensed the deep connection and good-hearted nature of Milo. Proof that not all of them were bad, and that if he could decipher Atlantean culture all on his own, perhaps it was time to put the people of Atlantis to the test. Now you might rightfully ask,
but what about the fading power of the crystals?
Well, we can say that since in this scenario the heart is a divine parental figure for its people, it would also know that they shouldn't always rely on its power. It helped them speed the process of progress, sure, but eventually they'd have to walk on their own two legs, much like how all the other humans and civilizations did. If the heart really did absorb the consciousness and emotions of humans, it would then become like a human. And now know that the cycle of life has an end as well, and one day so should it. Thus, the new mission would have been to help the Atlanteans understand that, since the symbiosis had lasted for so long, they had to discover that they themselves could power their machines with their own vital force. In fact, having the stones of the old king's fall could have only helped reinforce this idea to the Atlanteans that the heart wouldn't have relied on protecting itself anymore. Things were now going to be different. This is why the heart told Milo not to be afraid, that everything would be alright, and why it gave itself up so easily. It knew the only way Atlanteans could find that inner strength, that inner glow, would be if the source they relied upon was first taken away. It was all in its plan. And when they learned how to fuel their crystals and then the machines on their own, also thanks to Milo's bravery and knowledge, and saved Ultra Kita and brought her back to Atlantis, the heart would only then reaffirm its power, reawaken the old kings and even the stone guardians, and put all its power in saving Atlantis once again. This time not as punishment for having started a war, but as a reward for having stopped a potentially bigger one on the surface if Rourke had won. And in the end, yes, Milo stayed behind with Kita as queen after the heart let her go, but only because they now had to go through several years of training to relearn how to become a great civilization once again, without necessarily having to rely on the heart all the time. The divine parent would have worked to prepare its children to one day leave the metaphorical and literal womb. And hey, with such amazing lore, maybe there's even more great juice we can find in the sequel and...
We must get back to the throne room. Bobby! All right, come on, show a little respect here.
Or maybe not. So that was Atlantis: The Lost Empire. And I still stand by my statement that, despite its minor world-building flaws, it's still one of the best world-building examples out there. And it's admittedly a shame that it didn't do well at the box office and is considered a touchstone in Disney's decline at the time. Not that it doesn't have some truth to that. I have to admit some of the kid-friendly and wacky animation and humor kinda clashes with the more serious tones, but it is still a pity. Then again, everyone I talk to has great fond memories of this with a growing cult following. And perhaps that alone is a sign of a great message, that as long as you put your passion and soul into studying your own world, you're guaranteeing that it'll never sink in the long run. Anyway, that's all for today, folks. What do you think? Am I right? Am I wrong? Am I talking out of my ass? Maybe. Let me know in the comments down below. Feel free to like, share, and subscribe. Please consider subscribing to my Patreon to help support what I do here. And if there's any other franchise whose world building you'd like analyzed, let me know. Until next time, keep building worlds.